1950, Durham, Maine. Donald Edwin King sits at home frustrated with his wife Nellie and their two sons aged 4 and 2. A former merchant marine, Donald lived a hard life in Maine. He struggled to pay bills, struggled to take care of his family, struggled to take care of himself. With that in mind, Donald stood to his feet, kissed his wife and 2 kids on the forehead, telling them that he'd be back after retrieving a pack of cigarettes, and left for the afternoon. Hours passed, then days, and Donald never returned. Nellie, knowing her husband very well, knew that he lacked one thing in life, and that thing was persistence. The lack of persistence kept him from being a good father. It kept him from being a good husband. And secretly, it kept him from being a great writer. Little did Donald know. From that moment forward, the 2 children that he abandoned and the wife, but in particular one child, would go on to be one of the most successful writers the world has ever known. That second and youngest child went by the name of Stephen King. Welcome to the Stories We Tell Ourselves podcast, episode 6. Thank you for joining us for episode 6 of the podcast. I'm happy to be here on the 6th episode. Today, if you haven't guessed already, we're going to talk about persistence. And persistence as it pertains to the well-known, world-renowned writer Stephen King. I chose this subject today because the importance of persistence in life, let alone a professional or career endeavor, is kind of the thing that separates one from the next. And with Stephen King, there's a perfect example of someone who withstood depression, withstood alcoholism, withstood drug addiction. But to begin the story, Stephen King was born in Durham, Maine on September the 21st, 1947. His parents, Donald and Nellie King, were in abject poverty for most of his life. And after the father abandoned the family, Nellie and the children began to travel to live with relatives, and they were in Wisconsin and Indiana and Connecticut and several other places before finally settling back in Maine. Now, interestingly enough, as a child, Stephen always had a mind that was geared towards reading, but he also had a fascination with fear and just the idea of being scared. There was something in the emotions that came with being in fear that Stephen was always attracted to. And there were several moments in his life where that fear actually coalesced with the actual work that he did. One example was at the age of 11, while playing on a railroad with 3 of his friends. One of his friends were struck and killed by the freight train right in front of him. Later, his body parts had to be gathered and put together in a wicker basket so they could actually do an actual funeral. But interestingly enough, Stephen has no recollection of the actual accident himself. The only thing he knows is that once he returned home, his mother said his face was white and ashen, and he had fear that kind of trembled through his body, and he didn't speak. Later, that became the storyline, or one of the storylines for one of his books called Stand By Me, which ended up becoming a best-selling book and subsequent film. But that is kind of jumping ahead. For now, we're going to focus on his childhood. They grew up in a home without running water. He used to have to travel down the road with his older brother David just to take baths at a relative's house. And his mother struggled, as always, to make ends meet. His mother was a hard worker. She instilled those values in him and his brother. And to this day, that work ethic that he holds comes from her. By the time Stephen was in high school, he began to write more and more often, and he tried to sell short stories, but none of them actually sold. And to keep himself motivated, he got a nail, a hammer, put the nail into the wall, and he would stick each rejection letter that he received onto the nail as a constant reminder to keep that persistence that his mother often drilled into his head. By the time he was in high school, needing money for the family, he got a job as a grave digger. And it also became the motivation for his first published story, which was entitled, I Was a Teenage Grave Robber. The story sold for $35. And with that first sale, it set Stephen into a mode of thinking that would shape the rest of his life. By the time he was in college, he had written about 5 novels. The teachers and faculty often remarked about his appearance, how he was very poor, and how he would wear shoes with holes in it and sometimes the same clothes over and over again. And he had a long, smelly beard. But they also commented about his intelligence. And in classes during lectures, he was always saying perceptive comments. And he always had a very interesting and unique view on the subject matter, whether that was a book or a short story or a poem. Stephen was always someone who'd said something that was a little bit off kilter, but also intelligent, although macabre. After college, he was now married to his wife, Tabitha, living in a double-wide trailer, which they rented. And oftentimes they would call the electric company and request that they would turn off the lights or turn off the phone because they could not afford it. At this point, Stephen, working as a teacher at Hampton Academy, he had a total yearly salary of $4,600. Now, this was strictly something for maintenance of the family. His wife worked in a donut shop. He struggled to make ends meet. They struggled together, and at this point, they had 2 children. What he would do, whether he had to get a second job pumping gas or working in the laundromat, he would always make time at the end of the day to write. His goal, a goal which he kept and that he does keep to this day, is to at the very least do 2,000 words a day. And that kind of equals to about 10 pages. So this is what he did. Hell or high water, no matter what was going on in his life, it was 2,000 words a day. Now, in the midst of this, he was still submitting stories, still getting rejected. Bills still needed to be paid. Children still needed to be fed. In that mindset, he tried to write something different. At the time, he was sending stories, short stories, to girly magazines because they were the easiest to publish. And he intended to write a story for a magazine called Cavalier, which was one of the girly magazines of the time. And he started writing a short story entitled Carrie. Now, for those of you who don't know, Carrie is basically a story of a sort of hyper-religious teenager living in a town where she was not popular, was not thought about, and was often bullied. Now, within her, she had this sort of power to sort of summon calamity and death, and she kind of used that for revenge. But that is not the point. The point is that at the time that Stephen sold that first novel, it was the culmination of several events which might have prevented it from actually happening. Stephen actually started writing the story and gave up on it. He got about 3 pages in, thought it was horrible, threw it away. And one day while his wife Tabitha was cleaning, she saw the pages in the trash can and she saw there was a significant amount of words. So she decided to take it out and take a look at it and see what he had thus far. After reading the pages, she went to Stephen and told him that she thought that he should finish it. He didn't think he should, but he was in no position to turn down an opportunity, even though at this point it was all hope. So he did complete the novel. He sent it in to several publishers, got several rejections, but Doubleday, did express interest. And as his first payment for his first novel, he received a check for $2,500. Now, in today's time, $2,500 is not a lot of money, but when you're 26 with children, renting a double wide trailer, and depending on money coming only to cover emergencies, $2,500 was like winning the lottery. Little did Stephen know the little book which he threw away would end up changing his life forever. Once it was time to sell the publishing rights for the manuscript, Doubleday was able to secure $400,000. That $400,000 at the time was split 50-50 between the publishing company and the author. When Stephen, able to actually have a phone, did receive the phone call telling him that he was going to receive $200,000, he broke down. He went into tears, slid down the wall, cried, because he knew that through his persistence, he had somehow broken a curse that was on his family and his livelihood, and it was seemingly going to spread to generations to come. With that, he bought an apartment, got him a Ford Pinto. Some say it was a Cadillac, I'm not sure, and he began to write furiously. At that point, he had 2 novels, one unpublished. He had Carrie, but then he pumped out more. Then came Salem's Lot. Then came The Shining. Then came Pet Sematary. By 1984, he had written about 14 novels. The majority of them had turned into successful movies, and he was sort of a staple in the whole idea of going from book to film. Now, his life wasn't skyrocket to the sky. After that, he had his hardships. In fact, by the time he had started his success, meaning Carrie, his mother had already died from cancer. And at this point, after reaching so many levels of success, he found himself struggling with alcohol and cocaine dependency. In fact, his family in the late 80s, they ended up having to do an intervention so that he wouldn't ruin everything that he actually worked so hard to achieve. Now, after he finished rehab, he sort of had a new lease on life, a new understanding of health and taking care of himself. And he began to write even more prolific. He began to pump out 2, sometimes 3 books a year at that same pace of 2,000 words per day. And with that came money, with that came success. He bought houses. He became a charitable giver. I think to this day, he gives away at least $4 million annually to several charities across the country and abroad. But within that, there was still tragedy. In 1999, in the summer of 1999, while walking his dog on his daily 4-mile walk, he was struck from the back by a minivan. Struck so hard that although he flew off to the side, his glasses that he wore on his head were in the actual car. That's how hard he was hit. He lied on the road with a broken leg, cracked spine, and below the knee, his bone was broken in 9 places. The man that hit him, Brian Smith, he basically had a history of DUIs, and he's even had his license suspended at that time several times before. Stephen was on a long road to recovery. Even the doctors, they questioned if they should even amputate his leg, but they decided to see what his body could do. And over time, his body did actually heal. Now, during that initial recuperation, he didn't write. He couldn't write. He was in too much pain. But his wife, being as wise as she was, she knew that his only true recuperation would come from doing what he loved. So she encouraged him to continue writing as he healed. And that's what he did. He began to write. He finished his novel. It was somewhat of a biography about writing. It's called On Writing. And he just continued to pump out more and more books. Oddly enough, A year after the accident, Brian Smith, the fellow that hit him, ended up overdosing. And the true irony of it is that the day that he died was on Stephen King's 53rd birthday. And although that was sad, and even Stephen has expressed sort of sadness about his passing, he did continue, as we all know, in his prolific sort of writing spree. To this day, Stephen King has written over 65 novels and counting. He has a net worth of over $500 million. He has no interest in clothing, cars, or looking like the rich, although he very much is. But he continues that day-to-day 2,000 words spree that he has had since he was a very young man, because obviously that paid off with dividends. Now, the story of Stephen King is obviously one about perception. I had a couple of directions that I wanted to go with this episode. I was going to kind of go over the multiple novels and short stories and essays that he's written and some of the accoutrements that kind of come with that sort of success. But the thing I wanted to really focus on was the idea of that persistence, because a persistence truly is the measuring stick of taking a dream to reality. I know that even in life, we have certain things that make us want to quit that initial thing that sort of sparked our imagination, I guess, put us online, so to speak. But life sometimes gets in the way. And I just want to encourage my listeners to kind of have the mentality of persistence. Persistence truly does go a long way. In the case of Stephen King and countless other people, it was the only thing that kind of kept them alive. Even Stephen King said if he did not write, he knows that he would have died in some drunken stupor at some bar in Bangor, Maine, somewhere. We'll be right back. Thank you for returning. Now, as always, today we're going to jump into a work of fiction. It is a short story which seems to somewhat align itself with the theme of today's episode in one way or the other. It is a story that is entitled Abundance. And as always, without any preamble, we are just going to dive into the story. Thank you very much. Norman Taylor was the first and only child of Emily Sims. She named him after his father, although the two would never meet. Norman Sr. disappeared precisely 3 days before Junior was born. And like most people with love just beyond their reach, Emily didn't realize that she was abandoned long before he actually left. Norman's father did manage to leave remnants of himself in his absence, and like his father before him, Norman Jr. had a unique ability when it came to numbers. Now, at first, it wasn't noticeable. As a child, Norman was regarded as quiet, even slow, with a penchant for stupidity if pushed. He rarely said anything other than the word more throughout his childhood, and that was the only word he could pronounce without difficulty. Any other combination of letters would leave him stuttering or tearful, finally wandering off to be alone and question his place in life. All of this changed the morning of his 11th birthday. The air was electric, inviting, much different than the high one seems to enjoy during regular birthday bliss. When he awakened to the sound of Emily humming happy birthday to him in her security uniform, his tongue began to swell and pulsate, then tingle. Norman screamed as loud as he could. It was a muffled roar emerging from an underdeveloped well. He fell to the floor, writhing and tumbling in a panic. Emily, unable to calm him, simply held him as tight as she could, rocking him back and forth until the pain subsided. When it did, Norman Jr., for the first time in his life, said, "Thank you." Grateful to their Lord above, Emily chuckled and cried for what amounted to 4 minutes before heading off to work, promising to have a surprise for him when she returned. Norman attempted to say goodbye, but again, the words would not come. Luckily, his birthday fell on a Saturday. This allowed Norman to wander the streets of Philadelphia with the rest of the children whose parents either were too busy to be present or too absent to matter. Norman, who wasn't exactly popular, did manage to scrape up one friend in the neighborhood. Her name was Hannah, and she was beautiful, but not in the traditional way. She was thin, dark, and duck-lipped, with a port wine birthmark along her neck. She had the type of beauty that was hidden underneath teases and jealousy, the type of beauty that would ripen sometime during puberty, tossing her into the unpredictable world of adulthood, where pretty girls moved about with an ease that angered the unattractive. This beauty would be her safe haven from rejection and isolation, and at times an obstacle to be subverted and ignored in order to be taken seriously. For now, they wandered the streets of Frankenville, Hannah doing the talking, while Norman stared at her with silent love bubbling and settling in his soul under the weight of timidity. Hannah carried on about her looks, how she thought she was pretty, but no one ever told her, how she was starting to believe she wasn't, and how money would probably be the answer. Norman wanted to help her. He always did. In his mind, he thought maybe money would make her love him. Maybe it would make her see past his faults and celebrate the beauty of his efforts. He intended to work hard for her love. His mother worked 2 jobs, barely seeing him at all, if only for an hour a day. Norman would work harder than that for Hannah. He would toil away, hour after hour, day after day, grinding his dreams to dust, if that's what it took. He would sacrifice his happiness, if only to rest in hers. But for now, he had $2 in his pocket, and that was in change. Stopping at a neighborhood market, Hannah spent 50 cents on 50 pieces of penny candy and soda. Norman, about to spend the remainder of his coins to buy her more, froze at the sight of what he knew would be a life-changing event. Behind the counter, posted high above the attendant's head, an advertisement for the Philadelphia State Lottery, lit like a beacon before his eyes. The drawing was that night, a payout of $75 million, more money than an average child could manage, but to Norman, a series of scenarios and transactions flowed through his head. He knew exactly what to do with the money, who and what to spend it on, investments he could make, even the percentage of it he would need to win Hannah's heart. By his estimation, 55% will go towards investments and savings, 20% to his mother, and the remaining 25% to be spent on any and every whim Hannah could imagine. But Norman was 11, unable to buy a beer, let alone a lottery ticket. And even if he could, what numbers would he use? What would be the combination that would unlock the vault of his imagination? Sensing his despair, Hannah asked what was bothering him. Norman pointed to the placard that brandished the $75 million windfall and simply said, "More." They'd been friends long enough to know what that meant, but Hannah reminded him of the obvious, how they were too young, and best case scenario, if all went well and they were able to buy the ticket, how are they going to keep and possess the winnings? How would they claim the prize? Norman couldn't care less about this. He simply repeated "more" over and over again until Hannah grabbed him by the wrist and pulled him out of the market and back into the street. Norman hyperventilated on the curb. Sweat poured profusely through his braids and along his brow. Something brewed within him, something he hadn't felt before. Certainty. After a few moments of this, Hannah decided to get help. This help came in the form of a homeless woman by the name of Georgia Jean. She was 65, often drunk, but had been in the neighborhood for so long that she became a memorial to the good old days. Days where mothers and fathers lived together, holding down jobs at factories and storefronts. Spending and saving money within the community, actively recycling it back into the neighborhood. The good old days before cocaine and dreams of making it an entertainment were the drugs of choice. before those same storefronts and factories withered and dilapidated into hollowed out dens of iniquity. Somehow, Hannah convinced Georgia to buy a ticket for Norman. Georgia didn't resist. She just wanted the emptied out soda can Hannah held in her hands so that she could recycle the aluminum and use it to purchase more beer. Hannah happily obliged, and moments later, Georgia stood before Norman saying, "So what numbers are you playing, baby?" In his panic, Norman did manage to conjure what numbers he thought would win. Each had significance. Each number shone brightly in his mind. The first number that came was 3, the number of days his father left before he was born. The second, 31, his mother's age. The third was 1. After all, he was Emily's first and only child. Saturday was the 6th day of the week, so of course the number 6 was significant. Lastly, today was his 11th birthday. Therefore, 11 would be a good number to choose. He wanted to choose a number that bore some significance to Hannah, some number that expressed the width and height of his love for her, or how he wanted her in his life. But forever has no number. Therefore, Norman scrolled each digit onto a small piece of a brown paper bag that just so happened to float by and handed it over to Georgia. Georgia took the numbers, collected Norman's coins, and moments later, she emerged from the market with a lottery ticket in hand. Hannah handed over her empty soda can and thanked Georgia for her assistance. Norman attempted to thank Georgia, but again, the words wouldn't come. And before he could extend his hand for a solid shake, Georgia had already scurried away into the distance, hundreds of aluminum cans trumpeting with her from a shoddy grocery cart. On the way home, Hannah did her usual jabbering while Norman's eyes fixated on the lottery ticket. The numbers were beautiful, mystic even. His future paved before him. 3, 31, 1, 6, 11. Before parting ways, Hannah made Norman promise that he would buy her something nice if he wins. Norman nodded and smiled. She had no idea what he had in mind for her. Later that night, Emily arrived home from her second job carrying a wrapped box with Norman's name on it. He knew what the gift was. They didn't have the kind of money to waste on a guess. Months ago, Norman had pointed to a pair of Air Jordan sneakers and said, "More." Therefore, when the box was opened and the same pair of shoes were inside, Norman pretended to be surprised, hugged his mother, and handed her the lottery ticket. "What's this for?" said Emily, her hands hard and sore caressing Norman's earnest face. Norman's tongue began to tingle again, this time briefly, but long enough for Norman to open his mouth and say, "I love you." Emily, stunned and overwhelmed, managed to utter, "I love you too," as Norman sauntered off into his room, shoebox in hand, not noticing the crestfallen look upon his mother's face. In bed, Norman stared at his new shoes. He hoped no one would steal them or even worse, rob him. He hoped Hannah would like the shoes. They weren't his usual style. In his neighborhood, only drug dealers and thieves wore Jordans. In his neighborhood, Jordans were much more than shoes. They were power. They were powerful. They held the ability to differentiate the weak from the strong, the poor from the flashy, God's grace and the devil's envy. Norman continued thinking this way well into the night. Eventually, he slept, new shoes in hand, new fears in his head. In the living room, Emily sat before the television, watching the evening news, shaking her head and vocally hissing at the onslaught of murder and betrayal from around the world. After a commercial break, Emily's mind began to drift. Norman didn't know how hard it was for her to buy those shoes. He didn't know she hadn't bought lunch in months, and that she had requested several extensions on bills to purchase them. He didn't know that for her to get the last $50 needed to buy them, she let her boss's hands roam her breasts and buttocks. And tonight she had given him much more. But that wasn't his cross to bear. And as Emily cried as quiet as she could, the lottery numbers flashed before the screen, one at a time, slow and unyielding, building like rungs on a ladder towards a future that Norman couldn't foresee. 3, 31, 1, 6, 11. I want to thank you for joining us on what was the 6th episode of the Stories We Tell Ourselves podcast. As always, you can email me at swtomail@gmail.com. That is swtomail@gmail.com. And as we part today's episode, I just want to remind you of the importance of persistence, the importance of self-belief, and the importance of just trying. Until next week, be mindful of the stories that you tell yourself. Take care of yourself. Take care of those who love you. Take care of those who don't.